Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTube at War. This is a new BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan from the suggestion of a viewer, DDB. It's going out through the month of July where we are reading military literature, military fiction, military nonfiction, memoirs, poetry, fantasy, so military science fiction or whatnot. It's been a blast for me. I read this stuff anyway. I think it's an appallingly fascinating subject on which I cut my reading eye teeth, since one of my earliest reading experiences and one of my favorite reading experiences was Homer's Iliad, which is still one of the greatest evocations of the boredom and barbarity and whimsicality of war. And for BookTube at War, I have been resisting any categorical plan, much like I'm doing with other BookTube events this summer, whether it's the ongoing event of Book Trek or June on the Range. I've been sort of seeing where the whim takes me when I assemble my night's reading and wondering if it would form a kind of shape on its own. And in the last few days, it has. I kind of expected that that shape would be the Second Punic War, since in honor of BookTube at War, I am writing, or trying to write, for Camp NaNoWriMo, a story, a novella set, or reflecting back on one key battle in the Second Punic War. But it hasn't turned out that way. So far, for BookTube at War, I've been doing a lot more reading than I've been talking about on videos, and so far that reading has concentrated on World War I. Don't know if that will change. We're a third of the way through the month. There's still plenty of time for that to change, for me to move on to the Man-Kazin Wars or whatever. But that was certainly true last night. When I read this, I read H. Farrar-Hockley's The Somme. It's a pan paperback that I found a year ago that held up fairly well to a read. It's a thin thing, as you can see. The Somme usually creates tomes in terms of history, probably because of the sprawling size of it and the mind-staggering numbers. This took place from July to November of 1916, and even though that's a century ago, the numbers still have the ability to just shock. Well over 19,000 dead just on the British side, just in the first day of the Somme. And then it just kept meat grinding away for month after month after month, in a real wake-up call for the Western War. The West had seen this phenomenon, the phenomenon that happens when the gap between the valiant charge of flesh and blood and the entrenched positions of fixed artillery just widens and widens and widens. When that gap was small, it was easy to ignore. And then in the American Civil War, suddenly it wasn't possible to ignore it anymore. Suddenly you knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, at least logically, that no matter how great the valor was, no matter how wonderful the winning record was of the foot soldiers with bayonets, if you send them across a field on a gentle upward gradient towards fixed positions of arms and artillery, they're going to get torn apart. Valor will not mean anything. Valor will not save the day. And people saw that in the American Civil War, and they saw it in a couple of key military engagements after the American Civil War. But I don't think it was really until World War I, and more specifically really until the first day of the Battle of the Somme, that suddenly the last vestiges of that kind of romantic idea of war, that if you just try hard enough, suddenly those were gone. Suddenly, well, maybe not suddenly, but irreplaceably, the idea of machine versus machine started to enter into the picture. And if that's true, then the first large-scale war in which machine versus machine is the reality, but it isn't fully embraced by the people on either side, if that's true, then the things that are going to get ripped up in the middle of those two machines are people. And that's what happened in World War I, at least whenever full-scale battle was risked. And so the Somme has a kind of a weird, mystical draw to it. The idea has been for a century that the flower of English manhood was slain on the Somme. A whole generation dying in a hail of bullets or machine gun fire, or in no man's land, face down in the mud, with barbed wire on all sides. And Farrar-Hockley does a really good job of capturing that. He does, in this book, what a lot of more contemporary historians do as well. He will vary the spotlight from the very specific to the very broad, the very strategic, and then back again. It makes for really, really good reading. Can't help but think that maybe some contemporary historians learned a lot of that from reading his books. He wrote a couple of books on World War I and became a widely recognized expert. And I want to give you a taste of what that's like, of what I'm talking about here. I'll get to really go to any number of scenes that are in here. I'll just read you one to give you an idea of the way he gives you the man on the ground's feeling of what was going on. And also something of the weird unpredictability of the Somme as a gigantic, sprawling battlefield. A battlefield that, after the first month, had almost no natural features. You don't have to worry about the specifics in this quote, what quarry or what people or even what side. You don't have to worry about those at all. This is just get for the feel of it. With the 3rd and 4th companies now joined the first two in the chalk quarry. For 5 confused minutes, the whole battalion crowded the outer defenses of the enemy redoubt, shouting and talking excitedly, their prisoners scattered amongst them. It was 7:50 before the second wave was extricated and formed up to assault the inner lines, while the remainder began a systematic search of the dugouts. Yet all seemed well. 150 yards east, across an open stretch, no bobbing enemy helmets were to be seen. The inner defenses seemed as empty as had been found the outer. Whistles blew. They ran up and over the trenches, the leading platoons of each company spreading hastily out in line. And almost at once, almost before they heard the sharp crackle of the concealed machine guns, the first men began to fall. Before 8 o'clock, so this is under 10 minutes, before 8 o'clock more than half were dead or wounded, while the remainder lay in the cratered ground, sheltered from the weapons to their front, but often exposed to those firing in enfilade on their left. The assault had come to a standstill. It is one thing to bring men to assault with zeal. They will form up obediently while the guns pound the objective. They will leap with ardor across the start line and fight with passion as they tangle with the enemy positions. But it is another thing to get them going again when the enemy has brought the first brave assault to a halt. An ad hoc plan must be made, often by a man himself lying under heavy fire. His men must be reformed, and the plan must be made known to all of them. A whole new process of fire and movement must begin. That's a really good way to go about this. I've read my share of histories of the Somme, and some of them do only that and don't give you the bird's eye view, and others will give you more of the bird's eye view, which starts to feel uncomfortably similar to what the clueless generals of World War I have often been accused of doing. So I like this approach. I like it more, I have to say, in World War I than I do in World War II. But you'll notice something that went on in that passage. There's the assessment of what's going on, of the devastation that can happen in 8 minutes. But there's also an understanding, a direct personal understanding of men under fire and of commanding men under fire. And when I first read this book, I found it, I think, at the Brattle. And when I first read it, I skipped the preface. I skipped any introductory material. I usually do. And it was only when I'm done with the book, that note crops up consistently throughout the book. That note of, I'm going to consult all of the records. I'm going to get all the details correct. But I'm also going to sound that other note, that authoritative note of not only do I know what I'm talking about, but I know what I'm talking about, so to speak. And when I was done with the book, I went back and read the preface to see if maybe it would have some explanation for that. I didn't know anything about the author. Now I do. And I read a bit of the beginning of the preface that really did sort of shed light on the book. I almost wish that I'd read it first. The author writes, in telling the story of the battles, by battles here he means the many, many battles that took place between July and November. There wasn't just one battle of the Somme. It sprawled, like many World War I battles did. It sprawled for months and months. There were many different hotspots. In telling the story of the battles, I have made use of three main sources with perhaps a fourth subsidiary of information. Published and unpublished accounts, personal discussions with survivors, a study of the battlefield. I have walked the ground of every action described. And as a subsidiary advantage, perhaps disputable as such, I have been shot at in battle. And that gave me the answer that I needed right away. And then I looked up the author. I think I must have looked him up before. I think I critically engaged with a different one of his books decades and decades ago, because a lot of what I read struck me as familiar. And Farrar-Hockley, we don't know what he's referring to there in that mention, but it could be almost anything. I mean, he was attracted to warfare. He was in several wars, and also several shooting engagements that weren't wars. Like anyone who was a professional soldier before he was a professional writer, there are questionable elements. But I'm guessing that when he was shot at in combat, it was in Korea. Just from, he has a kind of an unbelievable record in Korea, kind of stories that, were they not fully attested to, you might think it's an old soldier just stretching the blanket. But this came out in the early 1950s. And I have read many, many histories of the Somme since then. And despite its brevity, this is what, 300 pages, 250 pages. Despite its brevity, I would rank this right up there with all the ones that I've read. So that's my my field report for BookTube at War. Sorry for the shortness of the video, but we'll get back to, I'll get back to bloviating in no time, I'm sure. But anyway, that's my field report. No idea if I will gravitate towards World War I next time, but you will be the first to know. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.